Hey, welcome to this week's Midweek Tip. In this episode, I want to talk about the role between a law enforcement officer and a coroner or medical legal death investigator. Now, the role of coroners and MDIs and police officers, they do slightly differ. There's a lot that is the same, but there's several things that are different. Law enforcement officers are very much concerned with whether a crime has occurred. Now, they approach each unknown death with the idea that a crime has occurred, and they work backward from that premise. Now, once they've established that a crime has not occurred, their mission pretty much is fulfilled. Now, the role of a coroner or MDI is a little broader, and although it works hand in hand with law enforcement, the coroner is concerned with establishing the cause and manner of death in all unknown cause cases. Now, the importance of a coroner's investigation is not diminished if a crime has not occurred. The difference between a suicide and an accident can often be very important to the victim's family. So once it's determined that it's not a homicide, the police may no longer be involved, but coroners and medical examiners certainly are continuing to be involved in that death. Now, many insurance companies won't pay for suicide. So our goal, if once a suicide has been determined, then our report is going to stand heavy with the insurance company. Thus, the coroner's role is a lot more extensive than police officers. Now, there's two major considerations for coroners in their relationship with law enforcement personnel and agencies. Cooperation and independence. Both are extremely important, and both needs to be operated simultaneously, but they also stand independent. Cooperation between the coroner and the law enforcement personnel must be mutually beneficial, and both sides must get along. The coroner will benefit from the experience and the expertise of law enforcement officers in a lot of cases, but law enforcement personnel will benefit from the coroner's experience and expertise in establishing cause and manner of death and a lot of the medical legal side of it. The problems I see sometimes is when the coroners aren't allowed to do their job, and thus there's a headbutting going on because police think, I'm in charge of the scene, you're just going to come pick up the body. Of course, that is obviously incorrect. That's not what the coroner's job is. Now, cooperative relationships seldom develop spontaneously, which means it takes work. All parties need to work to build a productive relationship. And while partnership inspires cooperation, a lot of times it is from the top down. So the coroner and the police chief or the sheriff, they need to get along first, and then that cooperation will funnel down to the worker bees. Law enforcement officers oftentimes will arrive at a death scene long before the coroners, and they free themselves from other duties and obligations to work this case. Now, the frustration of those waiting to move the body, move forward and move the body and do things like that, they can get caught up in this frenzy of trying to clear the schedule, clear their workload, and they kind of forget that the coroner has their job to do. So unless everyone appreciates the demands of all parties, like the coroner needs to do his part, but he needs to do it readily. He does need to delay his response, things like that. The work environment can be, pretty well toxic, and team building requires constant work. Relationships require constant work, whether it be in your marriage or with your significant others, coworkers. You have to always be fostering that relationship. Now, once a coroner has ruled the death was not the result of criminal act, then the law enforcement personnel will probably be released from the scene and released from the investigation, and they don't have much more involvement in it. However, most agencies, personnel will remain on the scene so they can assist the coroner or security, things like that. So that's cooperation. Now let's talk about independence. Independence is perhaps the key element in a coroner-law enforcement relationship. The coroner and the police at the scene should pursue their investigations cooperatively, yet separately. So the search and the collection and packaging of evidence, documenting the scene should be done together. However, the coroner and the law enforcement investigators should be independent of each other in rendering a determination of manner and cause. So many times I've heard of coroners waiting for the police to determine if it's going to be a homicide or suicide before they rule it and sign the death certificate. That is exactly backwards and exactly wrong. The coroner is the one that decides that. So, and it needs to be independent. Now, I do say a lot of times that it should be independent, and sometimes they don't agree. In cases of suicide, for instance, a suicide should never be ruled a suicide unless the police and the coroner agrees that it's suicide. Now, if one side or the other has reservations, then do not rule it suicide. Okay, that is a ruling of exclusion anyway. And so if one side or the other is holding out on that, they feel there's not enough exclusion to call it suicide, then don't rule it suicide. But each of these cases, or each case, is investigated together yet independently. The police has their job to do, the coroner has their job to do, they come back together and they make a mutual agreement in whatever the cause and manner may be. So both should attempt to eliminate any discrepancies in determining manner of death. And hopefully the facts of the cause, the facts of the case will be established by the evidence collected from both parties. Okay, and that will help resolve any discrepancies in determining cause and manner. Now, let me give you a little caution here. The coroner is ultimately responsible for determining the manner of death and the cause of death. So, it is imperative that the determination of manner and cause be one that you can defend. So if you are the coroner and you are ruling something a suicide and or homicide or accident, you have to be able to defend that. So if you just allow the police to say, well, it's a suicide, and you just, as a coroner, just write it as a suicide, well, you can't defend that, because all you can do is say, well, that's what the police told me to put on there. Well, if the police told you to put that on there, then what use are you? Right? So then that is you're not doing the job that you've been elected or appointed to do, because your job is to come up with that determination with the help and the cooperation of law enforcement. But you should independently be able to say, these are the facts that I know, and this is how I came up with this determination. So the role of a coroner and law enforcement personnel, they go hand in hand in a lot of areas, and yet you have to get along very well. But understand, you are also independent from each other. That's this week's Midweek Tip.